So brief introduction, my name's Austin Meyers. I'm the studio supervisor for the Molecules LA office. I want to kind of get a sense of where y'all are at because I'm here for y'all. I want to teach y'all what y'all want to learn. How many of y'all are like students, junior artists? Mids? Like 2-3 years on Nuke? Super senior guys? Okay. So I think what I'm probably going to do, because I can talk for an hour on just the merge tool by itself, because just as a comp supervisor, that's something I fight with artists all the time on. But what I might actually do is jump into a couple of just demos and just run y'all through some scripts for like 15-20 minutes, and that way the guys that don't want to hear about merges, they can sneak out to something else if they want to.
And any best practices or anything like that?
Yeah, well, and that's kind of, I want to talk about bounding boxes and formats and really, simple stuff that most people gloss over because it's like, oh, it's a merge, you just plug things into it. But there's a lot more going on than most people realize. They're trying to skip ahead to the fancy stuff. So I think I'll do that. And just to give you a little, I'll just walk through because that kind of gets out of order on my keynote here. So I'm actually from East Texas. I grew up, a couple hours from here in Longview, Texas. I went to University of Texas where I got a film degree. I then jumped into like turnkey video production where when everything crashed, all my low budget clients turned into no budget clients, and I wound up applying for a visual effects editor job in Shreveport, Louisiana for a company called Worldwide Effects that had just opened a Louisiana shop. They're actually a Bulgarian company, and the guy there, he's like, I'm gonna hire you as a compositor. I was like, yeah, but Final Cut's my tool. Like I've never heard of Fusion, and I only heard of Nuke just because I have friends that have seen a guy that used it once. He's like, nah, I'm gonna hire you for that. And I was like, oh, okay. He's like, here's a demo disc, you got a month, happy apartment hunting. So they wound up being a Fusion shop. So I started on Fusion, and then a month later they promoted me to lead artist. And that kind of set me off on this visual effects career. So from there I worked my way up to supervisor. So it was me and one other guy, and we had a shop of about 70 artists. We worked on The Expendables, The Mechanic, Drive Angry 3D, and Conan the Barbarian was the last show I worked on before I moved to New York. When I got to New York, I went to work for a company called Brainstorm Digital. I was a lead artist there, and I worked on Boardwalk Empire, where I won an Emmy and a VES award for our compositing on season 2. Which is, I aspire to be able to do work like that again. That was, it was really nice to actually have the luxury of the time and the money to be able to do that kind of work. So from there, I jumped over to another New York shop called The Molecule as a comp soup, and once I was there, I helped them kind of beef up their systems. They do a lot of like cable TV, they do indies, they do even some big features like our most recent, well, actually, A Walk Amongst the Tombstones is a movie about to come out. Some of y'all might have seen the trailers. Actually, it's really good. We did the VFX for that, and we also did the lion's share of the visual effects for The Butler, and even a handful of stuff on Winter's Tale, and there's always stuff we're kind of hacking at in the background. But yeah, so from there, like 6 months ago, there was an opportunity to come out and run their LA office, so I jumped out, and now I'm the studio supervisor in LA. Let's see. Over the last 2 years with Molecule, I've probably supervised something like 2,000 shots. And between all my years in node-based compositing, I've worked with hundreds of artists. A lot of them juniors. I've trained a lot of people up, and I'm here to talk to you about my system. This is kind of, over the years, this has developed into the system that I really try and coach my artists into to show that, to create a really clean, modular method so that you can approach things with multiple artists and keep it really efficient for when notes come back and you have to deal with client revisions and not have to rework an entire shot because they want to change something that's at the very head of your script and all your tools then get messed up. So I'll talk about Nuke in general. So I actually started in Fusion. I spent about 1.5 years in Fusion, and then I was instrumental in converting Worldwide Effects into a Nuke-based house, which is why the Foundry likes me, and I get put up to do things like this. So one of the things I really like about Nuke versus like layer-based is the extensibility and the scriptability of it is really whatever you can dream of. You can build any tool you want. You can build pipelines with multiple computers. Just, the sky's the limit in terms of building out what you want to do. It's also really efficient in terms of creating modules and being able to organize things. A lot of people talk about node-based and that you can do it however you want, and you can, but there's really only one or two ways to actually do it right. There's 18 other ways to do it wrong, in my opinion. Being able to work with mixed formats and color spaces is huge, especially when you start getting into these features and with the current landscape of cameras where you just, every 6 months there's a new camera that has a completely different color space. And the color space isn't really based on anything other than that's how they think it looks the best. So that's a whole nother long presentation. But that's one of the really nice things about Nuke is being able to actually manipulate those color spaces, pull them all into a common color space, which is in Nuke's case is linear, and then be able to work with mixed media fairly efficiently. So yeah, scalable workflows. CG multi-layer stereo is all really, that's big time because you can have multiple channels, you can have everything run in line, all the tools apply all at once. That's you can read about that on their website. Being able to work in 2D, 2.5D, 3D worlds mixed together is also a really useful thing in node-based, which is a little harder in some other programs. The trickier stuff, timeline-based editing, I don't recommend Nuke. It's actually gotten better, and I have a demo that shows some kind of timeline-based stuff, but it's a little esoteric in terms of the way you have to think about time when you're working in a node-based system, because each module of tools becomes a section of time, and there are ways to assemble it that aren't necessarily clear. They've also gotten better with their dope sheet and making it friendlier on people. Heavy text MoGraph is terrible, really terrible. I've actually been working on a spot this last week where we've been having to do some of that, and it's brutal. They've gotten a lot better with their new text tool in 8, but it's rough. So there's still things we actually go back to our MoGraph team, and they use After Effects to do that stuff. Quick filter-based work. Unless you have a really nice plugin pack, that's not what Nuke is for. Nuke is for building tools and being able to build workflows and things like that. It's not one of these things you can just drop something in and then click through and see what filter you like. Fusion was a little better that way, but that's kind of the beauty of Nuke is you can build those things that you want. So partly because I came from Fusion, I'm really big about, and there were only a handful of merge operations you could even do in Fusion. Nuke has like 20. Half of those are actually just the inverse of a differently named operation. So, I think is to make the shake guys a little happier, because when they don't see in and out, they get nervous. So when it comes to merging, that is by far the most critical thing in all of compositing. The merge tool you use for everything, unless you just have a stack of 20 color corrects with all kinds of rotos in there, but you can't even get away with that because you're going to have to use a merge to mask or stencil out rotos from each other so that your color corrects don't step on each other. But over, under, screen, mask, and stencil, those are the only 5 you should be using for the most part, unless you explicitly know why and are doing it for a very specific purpose. You shouldn't be using any of the other operations. The big thing, so I don't know how, in terms of Nuke, so the B side here, that's usually like in my stuff, I want to have a constant B side connection from the source footage to your final write. Because when you do that, the B side is what carries all the metadata. That carries the format information, it carries any time code or other buried meta. We work on some TV shows from time to time where they actually have time code that comes with the source footage that needs to be passed through to the final deliverable. And if you maintain a simple B-side connection, all that passes through naturally. You don't have to do a copy metadata or do other kind of workarounds to actually get that information out the other side. The other thing it does is by default, if you turn off a merge, Nuke bypasses the A channel or the A side, and just views the B side. So like that boardwalk script I just showed you, if you were to work that shake style and you went and turned off one of those, one of those forks coming down, the resulting image would actually be the fork you just turned off instead of the image without that fork. So when it comes to kind of teching a script and figuring out what's doing what, it's much easier if all of your additive information is actually piping down into the A and the B is connected to your original. So that's A side and B side. Format is kind of rolls into that too. Format is the actual size that Nuke expects the image to be, or Nuke is thinking the image is. Format goes a little bit hand in hand with bounding box or B-box. And B-box is where there's actual pixel information. So pixel information might exist beyond the format or inside the format. One of the really nice things about Nuke is those are separate entities between format and bounding box. So if you have a really heavy tool and you have this image that you've scaled down, instead of defocusing all that black area around the image, if the bounding box shrinks, you're only defocusing 1/10 of the pixel data, which when you get into big scripts like that boardwalk one, becomes immensely important for making fast changes. So that's, yeah, and I'll actually go into that stuff. I have a script that I'm going to jump into in just a moment. So LUT and color space, I kind of touched on that a little bit, how you can work in mixed formats. You can also apply lookup tables either as viewer LUTs, which only applies it to your viewer, so your final image doesn't get that baked in, which is important in some workflows. The shuffle, I run into a lot of people that don't know what the shuffle does. That's one to learn. It's basically a patch bay or a switchboard where it just takes one channel and you can pipe it to a different channel. So, and when you start working with, especially in CG, if you start working with multipass EXRs, the shuffle is a huge tool. Like you need it for everything because that's what actually lets you, if you want to move something into the RG, it's like mask A or it's ID pass 2 and you want that to be an RGBA value, the shuffle is the tool you use because you can say take ID 4 and make that red. And then when you view it, it'll actually be in the red channel. You don't have to dig around through different viewers. Premultiplication. So how many of y'all actually know what premultiplication is? So premultiplication is where the alpha is multiplied times the RGB values. And what that does is effectively punches out your image is, wherever your alpha is the only place you actually see pixel data. Because when you run into, there are some schools of thought where everyone likes, I've seen some guys that work unpremultiplied, which means they have an RGB channel that's full frame, and then they have a subset in there of an, if you flip to the alpha channel, then you see just the alpha, but it's in a, it's just a smaller area. And then when they merge that stuff back down, it actually does the trimming. The problem with that is you can't actually see what you're doing, which is my biggest beef with it. Because in theory, there are some, the guys that are really sensitive about color like to work unpremultiplied, but every color tool has an unpremultiply box, a checkbox on it. So if you're really running into edge issues, some of the other problems, there's always that box.
Why do you use screen instead of plus?
Screen does a different thing than plus. So screen, and actually if,
Does it do the same thing but keep it under 1?
well, screen only if it's the A. It's a, so basically like if you're working on a monitor comp, for example, that's where you really use screen the most. And you have a black, the monitor's turned off, but it's got a glossy screen, and you get these bright kicks of reflection. You screen your monitor whatever your monitor burn-in is going to be. You screen that in, and by using screen, it says, oh, the values from B are hotter here. So all those bright reflections actually stay in the image. It doesn't clip those off. So it takes the basic. Yeah, I think I said it backwards earlier, but it'll take those bright pixels from B and add those will stay in even with A. So you don't get this just like punched out look. It'll, any edge glow or any reflections will stay on top. So it's much faster to give you that comp feel. You don't have to pull a Luma key and then try and bring reflections back that way. The screen actually kind of does that math for you. And if you actually hover over the operation button, it actually tells you all the math for all the operations. So screen, for example, is a plus b minus a times b if a and b are between 0 and 1. Else, it's a if a is greater than b, which makes perfect sense.
I just told it really decide screen or plus on this one.
Effectively, if you have brighter elements of b, it'll use a except where b is brighter. So reflections.
Yeah, because we wind up like, here's like your iPad, your tracked iPad.
Right.
Put the front screen on there, and then we have to put the reflections back on.
Right. Screen does that for you because it'll take the bright parts. And one of the funny things is like, we'll work on this stuff and they're like, we'll put the reflections back in. We're like, well, they are in, but your screen is brighter than the reflections, and optically you wouldn't see the reflections if your screen is brighter. And so that's always a fun.
Is that an acceptable answer? Because I find science is rarely,
Uh,
Not to my clients.
that's science is always my baseline because that's always arguable. You can always support that with facts. You know, that doesn't work on most producers, but it's always worth a try. And the key is really more to say it like you understand it and know what you're talking about. Because when you do that, they're like, oh, well, of course, you know, and then you hear them tell it to one of their producer buddies, and they're like, well, no, the blah, blah, blah. And it's like, oh, you're killing me. Yeah, it's really just to say it with conviction. That's really the biggest, the biggest note. Because they're like, oh, okay, well, yeah, sorry. So, yeah, clients. So this is just a really simple, so here's a merge. And I know any of you that have come from another program and tried to merge two things together in Nuke just out of the gate, you wind up with something that looks like that, which doesn't make any sense relative to the two pieces you've tried to plug into it. I had the same problem when I jumped from Fusion. Part of that is because Fusion assumes a lot of things that Nuke doesn't. Nuke assumes nothing in terms of channels or size or whatever. Fusion assumes everything has a solid alpha, unless it has an explicit alpha, like it's a TIFF or a PNG or EXR that has an alpha channel physically baked in. JPEGs don't have an alpha, so Nuke doesn't give them an alpha. If you were to flip through these, red, blue, green, they're there. There is no alpha. It's just empty. So when you merge them together, because of the way an over works, an over puts something over, but only if it has a solid alpha, otherwise it pluses. So what we're seeing is actually the images getting plus together there. And because they're different formats, it's hard to tell here, but one of these is about 3K and the other is 5K. So you can see there's some tearing happening. I don't know if you can see that, but there's tearing happening right here. And then across the top, we can't see it all because it's all plussed. So you can see there's a little bit of tearing. That's because Nuke also, by default, takes whatever the last pixel is on the edge and then extends it into infinity if there's format that exists beyond that edge. So in this case, where we're merging one, we're taking the format information from B, but putting A in there, Nuke is extending that smaller image to fill the format. So to get something that you would expect, we use our fun shuffle tool. So shuffle, just to give you a quick, you have input coming in and output going out on the side. So whatever checkbox you're checked in, it just goes down and then over. So red, for example, it's the red channel is clicked all the way over, and that goes out on the red. So in this case, we want to create a solid alpha. We check this box, because that's the output line for alpha, and that gives the alpha a solid white value of 1 image there. Another way to do it, there's an auto alpha button in every read. It's buggy sometimes. So EXRs, they probably fixed it, but I also like to work explicitly. So when you see a shuffle there, that shuffle, you know it's doing something. So you can immediately, you know, and if it comes right after a read, you know there's some operation that's happening there. If you check that auto alpha box and then you swap out your read later, that auto alpha box isn't going to be checked per se. You have to remember to check it, where you can just have a raw image come in and just pipe that into the shuffle and you'll get a solid alpha either way. So it's one of those, it's just little stuff like that. It's like, yeah, it is technically cleaner to check this box and not have an extra tool, but this tool really informs me about what's going on. So we'll give this one the same thing. So now we're getting an image that's slightly more what we expected. You can see we still have that edge tearing where it's just extending the edge out. So what we'll want to do is we'll just put a crop tool on here. And now you can see we have an image that's, if you were to go into Fusion and take those two images and merge them together, this is what you would get. Now we're actually seeing that expected image. And it's because of the assumptions Nuke isn't making that you have to be aware of kind of at the onset. Because I see a lot of scripts where people will merge a smaller format over a larger one, especially when you work with asset libraries. You go to work on a 2K film and you're using HD assets and something clips the edge, you'll get kind of weird artifacts, and then you're spending half a day chasing them down, and you look at the HD fork, because that format is HD because that's where your source image is, and you're like, no, there's nothing there. And then you look at it in 2K once it's merged in, and you're like, well, something's going on. It's because that edge extension is fighting you a little bit. All right. So let's talk about any questions on any of that. Pretty straightforward. So talking about masking and stenciling, this, in my opinion, is the correct way to do it. Whether it's a mask or a stencil, a mask cuts out, so you get the B in the shape of the A, where stencil cuts the A out of the B. So you can see that's the difference there. Mask. So one of the things here, you can see our bounding box has now shrunk to match our A. So this is our roto shape, and the roto shape is actually generating its own bounding box. And that bounding box is inherited because in the mask tool, I've told it to take the bounding box from A. If you leave that set to B, the bounding box now matches the original, which is your full size. So if you were to run a blur or defocus or a median tool, something really heavy, it's actually having to process every single pixel in here, where if this is set to that, you're only processing a third of the pixels. So when you really start getting into high-res imagery, that becomes a huge thing. You go to put a median blur on something to do cosmetic work, and instead of just blurring a little patch on a cheek, you're blurring the background and everything else in the image. And the more and more things push into 4K and higher resolutions, this is going to be more and more of a concern.
Give an example of what you consider incorrect.
All of these. So here's the same thing, but this is what I just talked about in terms of format and bounding box. The default is union, and so it takes the furthest extent of A or B's bounding box and creates a new bounding box that encompasses all of that. Here's another way that I see fairly often, and it is sexy in that it's just one tool. The problem is a roto paint tool is also used as an additive process where you're adding paint strokes or you're adding a color or a shape that's, a shape with a gradient. So unless you actually go into this tool and look at its settings, you can't actually tell what that tool does on its own just looking at your script. Where when you look over here, you can see there's nothing attached to this roto and it's set to mask. That tells you everything you need to know right there. There's nothing tricky. You don't have to really dig into individual tools. So you can stay back at this level and actually know what that script's doing. Where here you can't. You have to really kind of open it up and see what's going on. So here's another way. This is a fun one I see a lot. I actually had a super senior artist working with me last week, and we spent 45 minutes talking about why he was doing it wrong. And he came over to my side at the end. So this is fairly common because it makes sense that you would want to use a mask input if you're masking something, but the mask is really only affecting the A channel, so people hook the A channel up. The problem is, if I'm viewing this and I go to turn it off, I don't see anything because there's nothing on the B input. It also breaks that B line connection from start to finish. So all your metadata, all your format information doesn't exist. It's just taking the root values. which is, in my opinion, problematic. Here's another one. This is shake style. Same problem. If you turn this off, you just see the roto. You don't see your source without the masking operation. And you have to really consider your format on your roto shape, because if you're working in a different format, this might work actually. You're gonna inherit the root format from the roto, which inherits the actual root project setting. Where here, as long as your format is set to no clip on your clipping in your roto tool, it doesn't matter what your actual format of your roto is, it just matters where your bounding box is, which is one of the kind of fun and also dangerous things in Nuke. Here's another really common one, which just on a personal level really bugs the hell out of me. Because it's like, why use two tools when you can use one that's equally as effective? Copying is similar to shuffle. So now we have and this is an unpremultiplied image now, because we have an RGB and an A, but the A doesn't actually correspond to anything in the RGB. So if you're working on this, you don't actually know what your working image is unless you're spending an exorbitant amount of time toggling between the alpha of a roto and then the RGB of a different clip, which I just personally, it makes things a little murky in terms of working through a script and figuring out what you're actually doing, because I see people adding stuff all the time they didn't know they were adding because they didn't see it because they're working this way. And then the premult tool actually it just multiplies the alpha times the RGB and gives you the resulting value. So you can actually achieve the same result here. You're just using two tools, which I don't care for. That's my opinion. This is the really fun one. And I've seen this come out of some big time pro shops where they use a multiply or a color tool or any other tool where you can gain or multiply. Gain and multiply are the same usually. And they take it and they mask it in. The problem is the way these tools work by default, it would make your image in the middle black if you didn't invert it. So I then see this invert, which causes a whole nother problem when you're dealing with mixed formats. Because if you put a transform after this, say you needed to do something to it, now your invert actually stops here, so you get an image that looks like that. And you can work on something all day and then put one transform in there, and then it's like, well, I don't understand why everything got crazy. And it's because of the way the edge handling works, and a transform crops your edges. So yeah, that's a really fun one that I see every once in a while.
Let's use the correct one again.
Yes, yeah. The correct one is a mask with a bounding box set to A.
I have a question.
Shoot.
Crop and reformat. I
Uh-huh.
noticed at the read node area is used to crop.
Yes.
Is there a reason why you wouldn't use a reformat there?
A crop inherits whatever the format values are above it. So, I mean, it's kind of one and the same. A reformat to me is a little scarier because it also will do some scaling. So by using that by default, and a reformat by default scales, it's set to width and it's set to center it. So depending on what you're doing, my opinion, whenever you're working an element that's going into an image, you want to work that image at its raw state. So you want to work it at its raw format, in its raw position. You know, you don't want to do any scaling until you're actually moving towards final comp. So if you were to roto this, but you know, it's like, well, we're going to scale it down. So you scale it down and you move it to where you think you want it in the final script, and then you do the roto after that transform. Say you change that transform, you now have to apply the delta to the roto. So if you can work everything as raw as possible, that'll save you time down the road when you start to have to make changes. And a reformat just potentially introduces changes that you might not want. So most of the time I prefer a crop in that situation, just because of the way reformats kind of default.
One quick question on your correct node there. The way it's set up now, I'm having a little trouble telling. Where is that going? The roto going into your mask channel?
The roto is going into the A channel.
A channel. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, not to the mask channel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because the mask operation cuts B by A.
Right. I was just confused seeing it sitting there.
Yeah, that's
You're not gonna use those two pieces of footage with the merge node and then plug your roto into the mask.
correct.
Okay.
Because you can't see what you're doing on the one side.
I got
You have to look at the combined image, which I actually talk about right here. So this is this is two images merged together. How am I on time? So here we want to put this one mountain, and we're playing backwards. We want to put this one mountain behind the other. So what we do is we've shuffled everything solid, because we want to work pre-multiplied. We then cut it out, working on the raw scale. So we've cut it out. We have this now small bounding box. So when we apply a transform, a defocus, a color correct, all that's happening on a lot less pixels. So we've got our kind of final transform that we want. Our stencil is actually related to, stencil is the opposite of mask. Our stencil is related to our foreground image. So we want to make sure that that's actually after any transforms you're applying, so that, because if you were to stencil out in the same place you're doing the mask, while it makes sense to combine all your masking operations, if you translate that image, you then have to translate that stencil, you have to change it the delta. So that's, just in terms of workflow, that'll save you time later to keep these on the opposite side of that transform from each other. So you merge them together. We'll show you the stencil here, and then they go together. So that, that's the cleanest way, in my opinion, when it comes, because part of what we do, anybody can put something together the first time. It's the revisions that kill us. That's really, that's the biggest problem, because clients come back and they're like, everything's wrong, change it, it's like, and then if you have things that are stacked in an order where if you change, if this stencil lived above that transform and they say, no, move the mountain left and then scale it down, now not only are you reworking this transform, you're reworking that stencil, because you have to change where that actually gets cut out to live in the right spot. And so that's kind of my goal as a comp soup, is to help minimize that stuff, because it makes changes not hurt so bad. And you can isolate, you can basically limit your exposure and not only have to rework the bare minimum of tools when a note comes in. So here's what you were talking about, where you have two images and you merge them together. As you can see, the end result is the same, but what you can also see is the bounding box is now way bigger than the format, because you don't get that benefit of being able to mask and create that small bounding box that's relative to your mask. And here you have to combine your mask operation and your stencil operation have to happen in one place. So for this roto to actually be in the right spot, whatever this transform is, has to live here also. So you now have two tools where you only needed one. And every extra tool you can get rid of. That's one less thing, I see a lot of people clone stuff. Cloning, in general, I don't use the clone tool. I actually do expression linking, because the clone tool tends to corrupt and then erase half your nodes on crash. So I highly discourage using cloning. And in theory, if you're having duplicate tools, you should actually merge things together before that tool happens, and then just use that tool once. It'll reduce your processing, and it'll really simplify your script. And I have another script that actually demos that if we have time. So here you can see that's what's going on. Here's another one, just same thing, you're just masking here, but then using a stencil there. There's infinite ways to do that. Another one, just really fast, that's particularly noteworthy. I see this on a regular basis, where you merge this piece over, and then instead of stenciling out of that piece, you merge another piece of your foreground back on top of everything. The only time that's really appropriate is if you have to actually affect your foreground. So if there's a light wrap situation, or you have to do some paint back or edge extending because of defocus or whatever, then that might actually be acceptable. But I see this a lot, especially in kids out of school and juniors, because they're like, well, I just need to bring that foreground back. So instead of stenciling out, because they have a real spider web of things, they just they cut a piece out of the original and then patch that on top, even though it's the exact same as the original image. You're now having to process more imagery. The other thing too is with these, and I'll show you on one of these bigger ones, you actually want all your additive pieces, you want to merge those together before you put them on your final image, because that way you maximize your reduction of bounding boxes. So in this case, we're adding this piece and this piece. We merge those together, and then we only have to apply the stencil to them once, and then they go on top of the main image. So you can see here our bounding box has reduced to whatever their actual size is. Instead of merging one and then merging another, you're having to process full frame then that whole different, from one to the next step, where here you're actually only processing what you need. So this is in, when you have multiple assets, if you were to you would just keep tacking on beyond so that everything keeps merging into one additive chain, so that any global tool that you want to apply to what you're adding, grain, for example, is always a tool that you have to apply to all your additive pieces. You only have to apply it once. Because I see a ton of scripts where each one just merges into the main line, and then there's 8 grain tools all across the bottom on each piece, but there's no, and then they're like, well, your grain's messed up. You then have 8 tools you have to change. Or you clone them, and then you run the risk of things crashing and getting weird. Or you spend time doing expression links, when really if you just merged everything together before, you can grain once and you're done. So here's another example just of what I was talking about. You have multiple, like this color correct and this grain are duplicates. They're exactly the same as this one here, and they're necessary when you work just putting each piece down. And then if you want to get the, the original rock back, then you have to add, cut that out. But the other thing too is you look at this, you don't actually know what part of the rock you're cutting out. You have to look at the roto, which in this case is scaled, so they don't even show up. They're not copacetic then, which is a whole nother fun thing. All right.
So what is the downfall to, instead of having the stencil right before the final merge, why wouldn't you just use the roto, the invert, put the merge over and exclude it in that roto rather than having the stencil using the mask channel in the final merge?
Here?
No, the second to last one from the, basically,
Up, down,
where
left.
that roto is plugged in, it's plugged that into the mask channel of the bottom merge. What is the downfall?
Here? On this piece?
Yeah, like that, where you're stenciling right before you do everything, why wouldn't you just, that? What is the downfall?
That stencil is actually the foreground. So you would want to merge,
You have to convert it, invert.
you would have to do this, but then these need this, and then it needs this. And I don't even think that's right. But you'd basically have to create a second merge chain. That's also something by working pre-multiplied, you want to keep everything as what you see, what you get. Because if you were to merge each thing down using this method, say the client says, well, hey, can you give me an alpha for all of your added pieces? You're like, sure, let me spend an hour and a half building all of your, because then you have to do this, and then stencil, now you have the alpha of your rocks there, but that still includes the foreground, so you then have to build another merge that stencils that out. So you now have 2 separate forks you have to maintain. So if you add pieces, it's just twice as much work, and it's twice as much to forget. So when you're in a, and because we're always in a rush, if you're going in and you have to make a change, you forget to make a change, or you add, it's like, oh, we need to actually roto this other thing. You add a roto shape in here, that doesn't actually run into your mask input, or doesn't run into your separate alpha chain, and it's more of a headache. So I got through that pretty quick. So how many of y'all are familiar with LUTs and color space and all that magic? Okay, so this is right, yeah, without being a PhD. Actually, and I should have provided a link. I'll throw some cards out at the end. my boss is a like math monster, and he spent months building a color space presentation that he's been flying to LA and New York, giving to people, that really goes through from your eyeball to the camera sensor, processed all the way through post out to your final monitor viewing solution, which is really, it's organized fairly well, and it's actually a really good read if you're getting into this stuff, because he goes through some of the new formats too. So it's not just log or linear. He's talking about Alexa V2 versus Alexa V3 versus red and then red space. Yeah, there's a lot there. So this, for those of you that don't know, Nuke has a color space option on every tool, on every read. You have the option to read it in a different color space. So linear, which is actually what Nuke works in, all of its tools are based on linear math, and then it's actually converting it to sRGB in the viewer, which is right here. So you can actually turn that sRGB conversion off, and then it's like, oh, that actually looks right. That's not really a good way to work. That's the whole point of Nuke, is you're not actually converting to linear, you're not linearizing properly. Sometimes it's hard to linearize properly because they will scale, there's old school video, they'll actually scale the range of everything so that it's legal versus unscaled, and that's the color space presentation. That's a different thing. So in this case, this was shot with a Blackmagic camera, which has its own log-ish kind of color curve. And just so you know when I say curve, I'm actually talking about these. So this is a LUT. These are the ones that are actually built into Nuke. And if you just grab them all, those are just the ones that are built in. Every new camera that comes out every 6 months adds a new one to that list. Like this one is lacking S-Log2 and now S-Log3 are both out. Blackmagic has its own curves, but those have to be applied via LUT tools, because unless you actually know the algorithm to generate that curve, you can't get it into this menu, not easily. So you can see the difference, and it's just a remapping where it says, we'll look at Cineon, because that's a fairly common one. So with a value of 0.5, Cineon is actually remapping it on your viewer to 0.2, somewhere thereabouts. And that's why you get a much sweeter, like linear images always look really flat and kind of gross, and it's because they're just 1-to-1 ratio. Where something Cineon, it's actually compressing that image in the darks, which is optically more the way our eye sees it, which is ultimately what all these LUTs do. They're just trying to make the raw image data appear more like our eye actually sees it, which is with richer blacks and sometimes clipped out highlights. So this is Blackmagic footage. We're just looking at it sRGB. This monitor setup is not probably the best place to do a color demo. These are a couple different curves, and this is just basically Blackmagic said this color curve is what makes this footage look the way we expect it to look, which is in theory how you should expect to see it in real life. So it's nothing it's literally somebody's opinion. And these are two different opinions by Blackmagic. They're both official Blackmagic LUTs, but one is for their one camera and one's for their other camera that have the same sensor. They just, one they like a little flatter and one they like a little more saturated. And the nice thing is, so say you were working other footage, you would actually make sure to linearize it here so that it looks correct in Nuke in an sRGB viewer, because then you can bring in three other color spaces and make them look correct in your sRGB viewer, and then in theory they all play nice together, which is really one of the beauties of Nuke, is being able to mix all that stuff and then punch it out, and all your color lives in the right range, etc. So that's that bit. Oh, my dad got bored. So my big thing, and I'll briefly touch on this. How much time do we have? We still got about 20 minutes. so I can put more of y'all to sleep. My big thing is modularity and isolation. So, and I'm actually just going to flip. I covered a lot of this stuff in general. I'm going to actually flip into a script and show. This was a user group script I gave they were doing a Nuke user group in New York a little while back. So I'll show you all that because it actually explains a lot of that. So this is an example of a script where we're just adding in, these become modules. So the way I like to think of it, and that's partly why I like to work horizontal, vertical slices become modules. And the concept of a module is it has unique tools. If you have modules that share tools, you should probably rethink that a little bit so that you can figure out how to share those tools. And it might be you have two stacks that share a bunch of tools, but they don't share with anywhere else. So you take those two, you merge them together at their last original or last unique tool, and then add the unique, the duplicate tools after that, and that becomes a nested module that's got other pieces. So in this case, like, we're adding these color correction tools, and we want to color correct all of them, add one color correct to those 4 different modules. But over here we have, 3 other ones that share one. So each of these is its own module, and then they basically form, it's like in layer-based when you have groups and groups inside of groups and groups inside of groups. You want to think of it as nesting, basically. And that's where you get your biggest efficiency gains, is actually in nesting similar pieces together so that you can reduce your tool use, especially your tool duplication. The other really nice thing about this is, so this whole stack here, these 4, could also be manifested like this. Does that show up? Yeah. The problem is these shapes all overlap each other. So you run into this problem. We're looking at the wrong image. So these shapes all, oh, come on. It's because I'm not looking at the right spot. There we go. So these shapes all overlap each other in various ways. And say we wanted to, the theory in this would be we want to color correct this quarter panel a different way than we want to color correct the windows and color correct the tail light. The problem with this, and then color correct the car as a whole, the problem with that is these are only locally isolated, so that masking operation is only happening on that one tool in that one space in time. It has no bearing on any other tool that comes later. So the result you get is this thing where they're all kind of added together. If you were to say want to isolate this, so the problem with that is, say they want to change, the client comes back and they want to change the base color, but you've now got this tail light exactly where you want it, and you go and bump something, you then have to go back and counter correct for the tail light. And I see that a lot, where that's the problem with having tools in serial, especially color corrects is where you see it the most often, is things overlap and you have to counter adjust because things overlap. So to get those isolated, the way I've seen a lot, you would have to do it like that, where each alpha is having to mask or stencil its neighbors so that you can create isolation that way, to fight the issue of local masking. So what I like to do, and I actually use this extensively on Boardwalk because I was working on a bunch of face shots and they had all these matrix of veins running through his face, and they're like, well, we want this set of veins to be one color and this set to be this color, but make the darker, lighter, redder, more older, make them crusty, and it was just the number of revisions because they were really involved as a client. It wasn't like we gave them one pass and we were done. We went back and forth 15 times on the veins on the guy's face, or making the eye socket darker or less creepy or more creepy. So the problem we were running into is the same thing. It's like all those kind of red veins, they all overlap each other a little bit, and you wind up with this issue of you adjust one system and then that pushes another system out. So you're then backing that system off, and having to counter whatever you did in this other tool. And it really, the amount of work it took to realize one simple change was massive. So this system kind of evolved out of that, where you're actually masking out the piece that you want. So each of these is now a standalone, completely isolated from the rest of the system piece. And then they're literally just laid back on top of each other. So it all sandwiches together, and it's really stack order that then becomes the important issue. So like in this case, this last one is actually an under, because that's the car body, and it now sits underneath everything else. So when you go and adjust the car body color, it has zero bearing on the other stuff, because those are actually solid shapes that are they're basically globally isolated. And I've showed this to some artists, and they look at me like I'm crazy. They're like, why wouldn't you just use the mask input? And it's like, because of this, because that's hard to manage. Where this is actually very clean, it's very easy to then turn pieces off. And it's also very easy to nest, because that's the other thing. If you push the color on one thing really hard, say you wanted to add grain everywhere that you added color correct here, you have to, again, create a secondary merge chain so that you can then apply that to your alpha, or apply that to your grain tool. And you now have two systems you're managing instead of one unified system. So in this case, you can see we have this all as one piece, and then we're applying one, a global tool to that whole section. Same thing over here. We have a couple of pieces. I think I really messed these up in my last demo. So you have separate pieces that are just their own thing. And then everything all comes together into one last merge before it then goes down and merges on top of your main footage. So any grain or other global settings, you can just apply it. Tracking is a big one. You'll see lots of duplicate trackers where people have tracked pieces. They're using the same tracker, especially like on locked off pans and stuff like that. So here you can actually just apply one tracking tool, and it'll track all of your pieces back together. And this is also works in the sense of like 3D worlds and doing 3D tracks. You would just do it on cards, and you would have a scene, similar concept as doing that kind of stuff, where you have a unified system. So you don't have duplicate tools. All right, that gives us about 10 minutes. So, questions?
I'd just like to see sort of a demonstration between using like noise in an ice store, like water ripple effect, versus the testing.
Okay. God, making me work. Because I don't have that built. Any other questions while I'm working?
Yeah, the one thing that you mentioned that seemed to counter a lot of the compositing Nazis I've taken classes from is pre-mult versus unpre-multiplied images. You don't seem to take your CGI material, unpre-mult it, do all your color corrections, then reintroduce the pre-multiplication later. A lot of, like you said, color-sensitive guys
Right.
are just like, you gotta do this, you gotta do this, you gotta do this. I've seen it 99% of the time it not bite me in the ass for not doing that, but every once in a while I will get concatenated effects of pre-multiplications that don't add up to a nice edge. So
Right. Well, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because order of operation also can limit your exposure to that a little bit. Like this, in this case, you don't have to pre-multiply because you're actually cutting later.
right.
So it's like, but every tool, if you look at any color tool, look at a grade, because a color correct, you have to flip through tabs.
Oh sure, right.
Yeah, every tool has a
Oh, I know.
pre-mult button. And if you're actually,
I've had other Nuke guys say, but this button is evil. Just like you said, don't use the auto alpha button.
Right.
It's just certain guys have certain things,
in,
and
in my, yeah.
Might have to do with also compositing CG stuff versus compositing.
Yeah, it's, there's 18 different ways that you get CG stuff too, because
Do they render it unpremultiplied
we,
or not
it's been
premultiplied?
my experience, at least a lot of the stuff I've seen recently has all come pre-multiplied.
Yeah.
So in theory, like we actually wind up just checking that box, but we also only check that box usually if there's a problem.
Sure.
Because it's one of those things like every once in a while. So what he's talking about, what he's specifically referencing is if you apply a color correct to a pre-multiplied image, it will apply a different amount of color to the thin parts of the alpha versus the solid has a value of 1 alpha. And that in some cases will cause like dark fringing or light fringing when you composite that piece over a different, over a background. By unpremultiplying, what you're telling it to do when you check that box is it unpremultiplies the image, applies the color correct, and then premults it back inside that tool. So it's not an explicit tool set that you're using, it's happening kind of under the hood. And yeah, in the sense that you're not seeing what it's doing, it's a little evil. But in my opinion, it's much better to work in a what you see, what you get world than in a unpremultiplied world. Because you're also...
Thanks for encouraging
Right.
my
Well, the other thing too, when you're working with big CG, big CG stuff, they give you a full frame image, and the actual CG is only here, but the unpremultiplication gives you pixel data edge to edge. Well, if you're working with 15 layers, that's a massive processing hit. So if you work premultiplied and you cut the image, you can then cut your bounding box down to a quarter, a fifth the size. So your actual processing is considerably less. So in the time you've saved yourself not having to process, you can check the unpremult box. So if anybody ever fights you, that's kind of what I say to those folks. It's like the amount of data you're dealing with on EXRs, it's like working cropped is much more efficient.
Arnold, they don't give you premult EXRs anyway, or unpremult
Right.
EXRs.
We use Arnold, so yeah, we just use the unpremult box. Yep.
So, does it make sense to work pre-multiplied, by checking those buttons, and then just uncheck them when you want the best looking thing?
In terms of, like on the color correct?
Yeah.
Like in this case, because this should actually be, to be correct, the correct usage, the color correct would live here. Because we're looking at, let me see if I can actually get it to do it. Half the time it doesn't. Let's see. So it might actually work for me. We'll see. Nope. Let me do something that's more extreme. Because a lot of times you don't actually see that. I would say 95% of the time, that unpremult button isn't going to make a difference for you visually. When you hit the end of the line, there are very rare occasions where you see like a dark fringe, and you're like, I don't understand where that's coming from, because you look at the alpha and it's clean. It doesn't feel like it's dark, and it's a premultiplication error. Let me see. I think it might be an offset. Well, that's a whole different problem. Actually, if you ever grade, and like this is a good example, if you grade an image and you're using offset or like a positive gamma, when you offset, you'll lift the whole image regardless of alpha, because you always need to unpremult then in that case. If you're certain color operations will actually force you into that. And I've seen some stuff worked where the guy offset everything, and it was a big huge script that had like 50 different layers of people walking and buildings and everything else, and every single one of those, it lifted the entire frame by some amount. And I went in there and it's like, oh, this is patently wrong, and unchecked all those, and then had a vastly different looking comp, because it actually hazed out everything that wasn't in that layer. So like if you look at this is all this lifting here, is happening from that one little piece because of the way the offset is set. So you actually need to be very aware of that. That unpremult button that's a big difference there. But again, if you were to take that and put it here, it has no bearing. So that's something to be aware of. If you can actually color correct before you cut a mask, it is better because you don't have to worry about pre-molt or unpremult because you're actually applying it and then cutting it. Anybody else? Was that helpful? Did y'all learn stuff?
Yeah.
Good.
When I do CG, and when I, let's say the CG is through one white on black, when I
Mhm.
add grain to it, and then you merge that with the alpha, the grain shows through sometimes.
Yeah.
So do I need to unmultiply, add grain, and then remultiply, or?
I'm trying to think.
Is
I actually,
there a way around that? That's the way I found it, but I don't know if that's
I do my grain a little differently. I actually cracked the Nuke grain tool open and added a mask input, and then I apply that grain tool at the very end of the comp right after. So in this case, I don't even know if I have it installed on this machine. Let me see. I don't. But I'd apply the grain here, and I have a mask input, and that mask input I then hook to my main system, which has the aggregate of all my alphas of all my work. And then I would put a little erode and a little blur on it so that grain will actually roll over the foreground just a hair. And it'll really help hide that seam because even if you have good grain, you can see that seam sometimes where it just, they fight a little. So if you can dilate, expand your alpha, and then blur it a little, that grain will actually roll over your foreground and it'll really hide your seams in a way that they'll be harder to pick apart. So that's kind of the way I do it. What do you
Do it degrained and regrained?
as little as my whole thing is try and keep it as close to original as possible because you get some clients that are really anal about A-Bing and they'll A-B and they'll see a sharpness difference on the main plate and then they flip out and then you've got a bigger problem on your hand. Then you're fighting with trust issues.
Do you have any of your work from Boardwalk that you can show?
Well, that first one I showed.
Others
Actually, I'll show y'all. I'll let this play while they kick me out. Oh, come on, machine. Did it? Yeah, there we go. Huh. Well, it's trying. I might be out of RAM. Let me quit out of my Nuke instances. Well, it's trying. Let me do this. So here's, this is probably my most notable work. We won the VES award for this, for best compositing. This was some fun stuff. I wish I'd known that soft body tracking trick with the ST map because we used a spline warp to mate the CG to his lip. Every time he'd slide his lip sideways, which they didn't animate, we'd have to bridge that gap and basically feather off that warp effect across his lip. But yeah, and same thing, like the 3D guys were amazing on this. It was a pleasure to work on stuff that nice because I've had some bad experiences with CG also, where it was really good to be able to work on stuff that was, I mean, you can see the lighting, their raw lighting was excellent, which really made my job a lot easier. I got to really concentrate on the nuances and making it as photoreal as possible. So, yeah, that's about all I got.